Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, for bringing us together to speak about the consequences of the war in Ukraine on the lives of children, their families, and their communities. Last month, the escalation of the war in Ukraine passed the 1,000-day mark. The UN has verified that at least 2,406 children have been killed or injured since February 2022, an average of 2 children every day. Behind every number is a child with a name, a life story, and loved ones whose hopes and dreams have been shattered. These are the UN-verified numbers only. We know that the true number is likely far higher. More and more children are directly caught in the conflict. The UN verified more child casualties during the first 9 months of 2024 than we did during all of 2023. This is the true cost of war, but it does not end there. The scale of displacement is staggering. Nearly 3.6 million people are displaced inside Ukraine, and almost twice as many, 6.7 million people, have become refugees. In Ukraine, the war is upending the lives of children. In some areas, it has forced families and children to live underground because of the constant risk of attacks. Children spend up to 6 hours every day sheltering in basements and other damp, dark spaces under blaring air raid sirens, fearing for their lives. Over the past 1,000 days, almost 1,500 educational institutions and more than 660 health facilities have been damaged or destroyed. In cities such as Kharkiv, classrooms and playgrounds have been replaced with underground makeshift schools, some of them in metro stations. With the onset of winter, children are exposed to freezing temperatures. This has been made worse by attacks on energy infrastructure, which have multiplied over the past months and reduced the country's electricity capacity to just over half of what is required for winter months. Some parts of Ukraine are experiencing power outages for 18 hours a day. As a result, many children in Ukraine are left without essentials such as heating, safe water, and sanitation. The war is taking a terrible toll on children's mental health and robbing them of their childhoods. Children are impacted by the constant threat and fear of attacks or violence, the loss of loved ones, the separation of families due to displacement, and the disruption of education, including isolation due to long-term online learning. The consequences of such trauma have a long-lasting impact on children's mental health. One assessment found that 1/3 of parents reported their children exhibiting signs of mental distress. With every passing day of war, more and more children will suffer while facing the risk of lifelong mental health consequences. UNICEF and partners are working tirelessly to meet the immediate humanitarian needs of children and their families in Ukraine, including access to safe water, education, and psychosocial support. This year, UNICEF and partners have supported access to drinking water for 5.1 million people in Ukraine and provided mental health psychosocial support services to more than 630,000 children, adolescents, and caregivers. We are working with municipalities to keep heating systems going throughout the winter and working to keep schools open and safe. In 2024, we supported the access of more than 450,000 children to education. We are doing our utmost to protect children and to ensure that children understand how to protect themselves from landmines and explosive remnants of war, which contaminate 1/4 of the country. But much more is needed to address the suffering of children and families. We again call for the support of members of this Security Council and the parties to this conflict to take immediate steps to protect children caught in this nightmare. First, all parties to the conflict must abide by international humanitarian law and human rights law and end grave violations against children. Attacks on energy infrastructure and the civilian infrastructure which support children, such as health facilities and schools, must immediately cease. Second, parties must refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Parties must also refrain from the use of landmines and other weapons like cluster munitions, which are inherently indiscriminate and which have a disproportionate impact on children. Eastern Ukraine was already one of the world's most mine-contaminated stretches of land, even prior to the recent escalation, a reality which now has extended to other parts of the country. Third, UNICEF remains deeply concerned about the number of children who have been separated from their families. We urge parties to prioritize family tracing and reunification and refrain from taking any actions that would alter a child's nationality or make it more difficult for them to be reunited. All parties and all stakeholders must focus on solutions that are in the best interests of each individual child. UNICEF continues to offer our support for the return and reintegration of all children in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And finally, the United Nations and partners should have safe and unfettered humanitarian access to all children and families in Ukraine who need aid or protection services, including in non-government controlled areas. We appreciate the generous support of member states in funding the humanitarian response and call on them to continue providing the necessary resources to address both the immediate and longer-term needs of Ukraine's children. Investment in the future of children is fundamental. Humanitarian efforts, while vital, cannot be a substitute for a political solution to end the war and suffering. Children are depending on this council to provide solutions. We cannot and we must not let them down. Thank you very much.
Without Russia providing the government of Ukraine in the International Committee of the Red Cross the actual lists of the children they've taken, we cannot estimate how many children are in their custody. However, we know this: 148 of the 314 children HRL identified were listed in these trio of child placement databases and were adopted. The placement of children in the aforementioned databases by Russia occurred after the illegal annexation in September 2022 by Russia of internationally recognized territory belonging to Ukraine. And this is important. Before that point, the children were held at temporary accommodations, including one funded by the Office of the President of Russia himself, at what HRL refers to as midpoint locations prior to the legal annexation for up to 6 months. After that point, they were listed for adoption. President Putin's personal presidential air wing and Russia's aerospace forces, according to analysis of online photos and commercially available satellite imagery, transported the children from Ukraine into and within Russia in 2022. 208 of the 314 children HRL identified have been placed with citizens of Russia through adoption or some form of temporary or permanent guardianship. And this is critical: 67 of the 314 children have been formally naturalized as citizens of Russia.
Along with the Russian citizenship, Ukrainian children also receive duties, including the defense of new motherland and military service. In order to prepare children to fulfill this duty, each year the Russian Federation, with the assistance of Belarus, displaces more than 40,000 Ukrainian children from the occupied territories to re-education camps that transfer them into loyal patriots of Russia. The network of these camps comprises at least 13 institutions in occupied territories, 18 in Belarus, and 67 in Russia. Most of these camps are involved in pro-Russian militaristic initiatives. For example, at the Avangard camp in the Volgograd region, Ukrainian boys and girls were trained in fire, tactical, and engineering trainings, as well as in parachute jumping. When countries that disregard the basic principles of the international legal order build the system to raise children as soldiers, this is a threat not only to Ukraine, but to a global peace and security, because this is a clear sign that these countries are preparing a new war of aggression.
Russia has sought to systematically erase these children's identity. It is no wonder the country appears in the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict for violations against children committed by its officials, including killing and maiming children and attacking schools and hospitals. In March of this year, we joined the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children. We continue to support Ukraine's national authorities, international efforts, and civil society in pushing for the safe return of Ukrainian children and for accountability. And today, I can announce the U.S. Department of State is pursuing visa restrictions for 5 additional Russia-backed or Russia-installed officials for their involvement in human rights abuses of Ukrainian children in connection with their forced deportation transfer, and confinement.
At the outset, let me underline the invaluable role that UNICEF and other humanitarian organizations are playing in Ukraine, where the war is having a devastating impact on children, as we just heard today. Death, injuries, and trauma are clear, with devastating consequences on physical and psychosocial well-being for the country's 7.5 million children. So on 20th of November, we commemorated the 35th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. After more than 1,000 days of war, this core international human rights instrument represents another unimplemented international agreement for the children of Ukraine, killed, injured, deprived of carefree childhood and safe family environment without access to education and health care. Moreover, thousands of Ukrainian children were separated from their families, forcefully transferred or unlawfully deported within the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine and to Russia. Their whereabouts, for most of them, remain unknown and their future uncertain.
Last but not least, on education. The wanton destruction of schools and other educational facilities continues to severely disrupt children's education and has lasting effects on their future lives. Indeed, nearly 40% of Ukrainian students are learning online, and many face severe learning loss. During the Korean War, children in my country similarly endured immense suffering in the forms of displacement, family separation, and the loss of education. The conflict on the Korean Peninsula caused 1 million civilian casualties and left tens of thousands of orphans and widows, with deep scars lingering for generations.
The conflict's progression is particularly challenging as the region approaches the harsh winter months, which will inevitably exacerbate the already dire living conditions of affected populations. Children and women are the most vulnerable, bearing a devastating burden of this protracted conflict in Ukraine. Reports of violation of children's rights are profoundly tragic. Children killed, injured, missing, forcibly displaced, sexually abused, malnourished, and systematically deprived of essential health care and educational service underscore the conflict's devastating humanitarian impact. We therefore call on the parties to ensure the protection of civilians, in particular women and children.
The risks of an escalation that would further undermine international stability and peace. All of these factors, interconnected as they are, highlight the urgency of putting an end to this war.
Once again, calls upon all parties to favor a diplomatic approach and to engage in a genuine dialogue that can put an end to this conflict once and for all.
France condemns the forced transfer of Ukrainian children to areas temporarily occupied by Russia, or being sent to Russia with a policy of forced assimilation. We demand that they return those children to their Ukrainian families, their guardians and their communities. We remain committed to ensure their return and to support efforts undertaken, including the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, co-chaired by Canada and Ukraine.
The strongest terms, the unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Madam President, Russia's attacks on critical civilian infrastructure are deplorable and cannot be tolerated, seriously affecting Ukrainian children who deserve to live in dignity and grow up in a safe environment surrounded by friends and family without fear.
Did not ask for this war, but will be forced to carry its trauma and scars well into adulthood. Guyana deplores the high toll that the war has taken on the lives of innocent men, women, and children, and continues to call for an immediate end to the hostilities and to all attacks against civilians and civilian objects.
Switzerland is deeply concerned by the deportations and illegal transfers of Ukrainian children within the occupied territories and to Russia, as documented by the Independent Commission of Inquiry. Many parents do not know where their children are or how to contact them. Deportations and illegal transfers constitute serious violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention and war crimes. With regard to the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court in this respect, Switzerland reiterates its support to the court and underscores that the independence of this judicial institution must be respected. We deplore all forms of threats or measures taken against the court, its officials, and those who cooperate with the court.
The fighting on the ground has intensified with the risk of escalation and expansion. Much of the major infrastructure in conflict zones has been damaged to varying degrees. There is serious lack of supplies, difficulties in ensuring basic public services, including water, heating and electricity. With the onset of another winter, the local population, especially children and other vulnerable groups, are about to face the double challenge of a hot conflict and cold winter. The humanitarian situation is worrying. We reiterate our call on the parties to the conflict to strictly comply with international humanitarian law, make every effort to ensure the safety of civilians and civilian infrastructure, scrupulously abide by Security Council Resolution 1261, and effectively strengthen the protection of children in armed conflict. Children are the most innocent victims of armed conflict. To protect and save children from armed conflict, the ultimate way is to eliminate and defuse conflict so that children can be spared of its scourge. To this end, first and foremost, we must de-escalate the conflict. As we speak, an increasing number and variety of weapons with growing lethal capability are poured into the Ukraine battlefield. This is deeply worrisome and disturbing. We call on both parties to the conflict to exercise calm and restraint, to push for de-escalation to avoid further loss and suffering. Second, we must achieve a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. At present, the international community's discussions on the Ukraine crisis are increasingly geared towards negotiation and edging closer to peace. We call on the two parties to the conflict to respond positively to the international community's call for peace, demonstrate political will, meet each other halfway, initiate peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community to provide support, create conditions for this to happen, and work together to maximize peace efforts and foster synergy for peace talks. Third, we must restore lasting peace. The Ukraine crisis is the result of security tensions in Europe blowing up all at once. The key to achieving a final settlement to this crisis still lies in upholding the principle of indivisible security, building a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture in Europe, thereby restoring durable peace and stability to the European continent. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent. We always stand on the side of peace, on the side of dialogue. We are committed to facilitating peace talks and seeking political solution. Since the outbreak of the conflict, we've laid out 4 points about what must be done that underpin political solution, issued position papers, and worked with Brazil and other global South countries in launching the Friends for Peace group on the Ukraine crisis at the UN. We are ready to continue to work with the international community to support peace efforts and contribute to political settlement to the crisis. Thank you, President.
Of explosive weapons with wide area effects, particularly in populated areas, we highlight the life-altering consequences of mines, especially on children, which is why 160 countries have signed the Mine Ban Treaty. Furthermore, the continued targeting and military use of schools and hospitals constitute grave violations against children.
Constant attacks on energy infrastructure have decimated power generation, leaving millions of families with limited electricity, heating, water, and sanitation services. Approximately 1.7 million children are without safe water, and 3.4 million lack access to centralized sanitation, heightening the risk of disease amidst plummeting temperatures. As Ukraine approaches its third tough winter, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned that the repeated attacks on energy infrastructure will result in further disruptions of essential services such as water, gas, and heating.
Russia continues to deport and indoctrinate Ukrainian children. As an occupying power, Russia has an obligation not to forcibly transfer or deport the Ukrainian civilian population from and within the occupied territory. Yet the government of Ukraine reports that 19,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly deported to Russia or Russian temporary occupied territories, a practice which we saw previously in Crimea. An estimated 6,000 Ukrainian children have been relocated to re-education camps. In these camps and in schools within the temporarily occupied territories, Russian authorities subject children to indoctrination through use of a curriculum that rewrites history and in some cases involves military training.
The world must stand united in denouncing this senseless violence and providing unwavering support to the children of Ukraine. Madam President, we endorsed the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Bielova, Russia's ombudsperson for the children's rights, however cynical that sounds, for the deportation of children.
President, we are deeply alarmed by the devastating impact of Russia's aggression towards children. The numbers speak for themselves. According to the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, over 2,200 children have been killed or injured since the start of the invasion. Thousands of schools across Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed. In July, Russia hit Ukraine's largest children's medical center, Okhmadit Hospital. Children are deeply affected by Russia's deliberate strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure.
Russia has learned that it cannot destroy Ukraine on the battlefield. Therefore, it purposely and systematically violates international law in an attempt to try to weaken the resilience of Ukrainians and its tactics. Killing, forcibly transferring, and deporting Ukrainian children is the most dreadful part of Russia's policy. The Baltic states strongly condemned Russia and its accomplices in executing the horrible acts of crime. Urgent collective action is needed to stop Russia's atrocities and facilitate the immediate and safe return of all Ukrainian children.
I also want to say that from Canada's own history, we know something of the terrible consequences of children being taken from their families, from their communities, either to residential schools or more recently for forced adoptions. This is part of our history. It's a history of which we are trying to learn more and from which we are still recovering. Because the trauma of these events is with us still. 150 years ago, the purpose of the policy that was perpetrated at the time was described as the need to take the Indian out of the child. Let us not make the mistake of trying to take the Ukrainian out of the child. Children are entitled to their identity, they're entitled to their language, they're entitled to their culture, they're entitled to be home. As the Secretary General has reported, Russia has exposed Ukraine's children to all 6 grave violations of children in armed conflict through its invasion, and many have been forced to flee their homes under constant threat of attack. We believe strongly that any peace agreement in Ukraine that does not adhere to the UN Charter and does not adhere to international law would in effect erase its victims and have grave implications for international peace and security in all corners of the world. Canada remains committed to working with Ukraine and with all member states to achieve the objectives of peace, of reconciliation, of justice, and above all, doing the right thing for children. Thank you, Madam President, for this opportunity.
Good. I thank the representative of Canada for their statement.